Welcome to Season 2 of Scaffolds. This is Monique Rivera, your host and assistant professor of entomology at Cornell Agritech. Co-hosting with me is my pathology counterpart, Kerik, who's an associate professor of plant pathology. This year we will also be joined by Kelsey Tobin, a postdoctoral researcher in my lab, and occasionally also by Anna Wallis, our New York State fruit coordinator. In this episode, we hear from Kerik about the basics of fire blight management in blossoms and scab and blight forecasting. And then we have a state-of-the-state update on degree day accumulation and phenology from Anna. This week for the entomology update, we have a bonus episode on pollinators with Dr. Scott McArt. Please check it out.
Okay, let's have another week of some disease forecasts. It's April 28th, going into a really interesting week. We are currently being rained on for the moment. And if we go ahead and we take a look, we'll start with apple scab first, and we'll go through the different areas, and we will look at Long Island. What are we predicting? I'm now moving Long Island's green tip a little bit ahead by basically 10 days. Right now it's predicting the 7th. I'll go ahead and move it to the 17th and see how that things change. Now, it doesn't look like a big week for Long Island. Just a little blip. I mean, there's currently a little bit of rain right now, depending on the place that you check. Lyrac is not picking up on a lot of precipitation and water, and it doesn't look like a discharge or an infection event there. But if you select the other location and near Riverhead, the MCV, you'll see that the picture changes a little bit. Yeah, they're in an infection period. It's still a really high level vascular maturity, about 86 or so when you change the date up, but the ejection itself is really only like 2 or 3% at most, 4% at most. So this is a pretty easy week, even though there's a lot of rain. The temperatures are just around the low 50s, and there's just enough not to really trigger those infection events, particularly with the type of discharge that we're having. Let's see if it's a lot at night. Not necessarily. The percentages are still fairly low, and the rain amounts, it's kind of a little bit of a drizzle. If you get a chance in there's just put some sort of protectant on. You could even try out a biological this week. Now, moving up the state into the Hudson Valley, things look a lot more terrifying. If you will, I'm going to move their date ahead 10 days as well. We don't want the simulation to end. And when you do that, things don't look so good. It looks a much heavier looking event, about 73% mature, looking at almost 47% ejection with the infection event that's ongoing right now. You've got about 12 to 20 off there, then another 2 for the 29th, which looks like your lightest day in this sort of ongoing rain period. And it's sort of in a combined forecasting event right at the moment. And it looks like another larger ejection coming up again on the 30th. So in this little break, if you do get a break tomorrow, recommend going in there with a really strong protectant and a good single site with the best post-infection activity. It should help clean up anything that slipped through during the big event on the 28th and over the weekend, and then protect you for the little bits of rain that you have to come. Moving up into the Capital District in Voorheesville, another similar situation. There is an ejection event going on right now. There's just kind of a long, prolonged infection period, with the bigger bulk of the ejection coming towards the very end, with the rain predicted around the 30th and the 1st. I don't think we need to move the green tip date here. It's predicting a 4-8 and a little bit about 35% maturity. And unfortunately, with the ejection that's currently going on now of 9% plus the 20 coming up, you're looking at about 31 or more percent ejection with a big forecasting event that's just going to go straight from the 28th through almost the 2nd of May. And not a lot of rain, but just enough to constantly make a leaf wetness for a big apple scab event. And at the end of this one, if you can get in there and sneak in an application on the 29th, go ahead. Yep, a single site and a protectant to kick back, protect forward. If not, you might have to wait till the May 2nd to sort of do that. Moving up into the Finger Lakes, similar situation. Everywhere is sort of in this long, prolonged, not high level of rain, like a 1/10 of an inch of rain or maybe a quarter, and a long infection and wetting event period. So with 11% ejection today and moving the green tip date in the Finger Lakes, we would want to move that back from about the 23rd. You're looking at about about 67% maturity, and about 38 or almost 40% ejection in this massive period. And depending on where you are, you might not get that break on the 29th to do cleanup. So you might have to weather this one and then apply your protectant and single site fungicide at the end of the week and get, no doubt, the rain that's probably coming next weekend as well. It's a this is a really bad week for apple scab, at least as we go towards the more southern parts of the state and a little bit even towards the western New York area. I'd say this might be called the big one for the season. Let's just hope there's not a second big one that I'll be talking about next week. The same sort of situation is just this constant wetting period. Looks like up in Williamson, it just began on the 27th. Good bit of rain, a massive amount of discharge there. I'm going to move its green tip date away from the 313 prediction up to 323. And you can just see that this is going off with 25% discharging on April 27th. A little dip. You're going to get a slight break between today and tomorrow. Maybe you'll be able to get in there and protect it up and put a single site to get back anything that slipped through on the 27th, 28th infection and protect against that April 30th. What's it look like? Temperatures in the high 50s creeping around. Looks like we get a slightly cooler day tomorrow. Not a lot of rain, just a constant amount of leaf wetness. The plants aren't getting enough time to dry up, and the apple scab will absolutely love it. Heading up to the top, Niagara. All right, so what are we looking at there? I'm going to move its green tip date away from 312 to 322. Don't want this simulation to end. I think this might be a better indication of what the apple scab was using in terms of degree days. Once again, they're in a big one as well. It's a more longer, drawn-out period, about 73% in the maturity, and about a 32% ejection event once you start adding up all of these ejection numbers that come out, with the biggest percentage on the 27th, a little bit yesterday, and it's just a long, drawn-out period of leaf wetness. It looks like, according to the charts, they're showing a potential break on the 29th, allowing you, hopefully, orchards aren't too wet, you could get in there and put that single site in and protect forward for the rest of the drizzle that could be coming towards the end of April and the beginning of May. All right, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about fire blight. Going back to Riverhead, Long Island. Fortunately, in the fire blight world, things are looking pretty good. Even though we are starting to see some higher temperatures and a little bit of dip here and there into the 70s, Long Island remains fairly cool. And the cougar blight daily TRVs never go above 21 or in the marginal era. And the epiphytic infection potential, the EIP values are around 0 and 3. And the only reason it's turning yellow or moderate is because you have bloom. Usually daily average temperatures above 55. Things are creeping up above 55 in the current area and will continue to do so. But I don't think at this point you need to panic and go for a hardcore antibiotic or anything at this point. It's just so low with these EIP values. It seems scary because of all the weather and the warmer temperatures, but it's staying just a little cooler there. Now, things get a little more challenging when we move into the Hudson Valley. In this case, they may actually need to take action. And I'm just even going to go with the default value of 411. In this case, the first blossom open date in the NEWA model doesn't actually affect the predictions. It just keeps the model running. So in this case, you can move that all around as long as there's flowers on it. It's not like going to change your TRV values. It won't change the EIP values, much like the green tip date does change the ejections and the maturities in the apple scab model. So you can have a little more freedom to see what it can do without actually giving yourself any strange predictions. Now, the Hudson Valley looks pretty intense. It's been cold, but it is ramping up. And when I look at their weather summary map, I see lots of temperatures creeping up towards the 70s and 75 area, where fire blight bacterium really loves going. And then the lows are moving only into 45 or just even in the 50s, which is going to keep that accumulation of TRV values and EIP. So it looks like that around, as we start to move into the 29th tomorrow and the 30th, things are going to be a little more intense. They're going to go from EIP values of 0 and TRV values of 21 and marginal and low, all the way up to an actual infection predicted on the 30th. So if you're going to hit that 80-degree temperature like is predicted a little ways in the future, I think they show a high of around the 80s on one of those days. Yep, around the 28th or 29th. That's going to allow those populations to build up a little bit. And then with all the wetting in the area and dew and leaf wetness and sort of drizzle we have, it might be important to go after those. When we move up the state, you creep up closer to the capital district, you may be slightly safe. In this case, you'll see a slightly different picture. It's just now predicting bloom. TRV values are very low. EIPs are still mostly under zeros, but depending how close you are to the Hudson Valley, you may have more problems to deal with as it comes into the thing. But it's just really predicting a few highs, and that's just because of the high average daily temperature and the lack of maybe cooling at night, but your EIPs are only at 15. I don't think I would use up one of my fancy antibiotics. I'd stick with a biopesticide if you actually even felt like you had to spray for that one. Moving into Peru, you're fine. Most likely your apples aren't in bloom, but even if they are, you're going to be looking at marginal and low levels of infections across the board. Now, the Finger Lakes is a little more challenging. It's not overly too scary. We are getting some of the hotter periods. I start to sweat a little more as I walk in and amongst the farms looking at apples. And you're going to start to see a few daily TRV values beginning to approach 113 or 157 by May 2nd. The EIP is still under 24, 46, 49. Still fairly low, and I think it's because of the low temperature dips at night. You'll see a couple average daily temperature days of 63, 65 on the averages. It's going to get higher in the 70s and make you worry on the 30th and 1st. But as we get towards the 1st, as we learn from the apple scab stuff, the risks will die. And as you move up later in the further west of the state and up closer along the lake, it's still, you get some high temperatures, but you're going to have a lot more cooler days on average, maybe a spike or two in the 70s, but it won't persist and stay at that temperature for very long. Not long enough to accumulate heat hours. You're really only looking at about 30 TRV at the highest, 16 in the highest EIP. Niagara County, maybe 43, 26, maybe a little bit of high weather, but really low EIP of 26. And that's only because of maybe a failure to dip too cool at night or just sort of staying in the very low 60s, high 50s for a lot of the day along those areas. Okay, that's it for forecasting this week. I'll talk a little bit more about some other tips for looking at fire blight forecasts and making some applications at bloom. Now that we're in the fire blight season, we're getting predictions. Almost everywhere has bloom, except for maybe Lake Champlain area. Let's talk a little bit about forecasting fire blight and infection events. Step 1, always keep track of your first blossom open dates for each of your varieties, particularly those that are most susceptible to fire blight. Use a piece of paper or note application on your phone. Keep those records down there, probably right next to where you're keeping the records for antibiotic applications. And also to make sure to use these dates over the dates that NEWA predicts, just to increase the prediction in the NEWA model. Anytime you're any of these less than accurate model default dates or sort of generalized regional updates, don't use these. Use your own bloom dates as best as possible. As you might like, keep the model open. You might have to adjust your bloom period a little bit later than your actual bloom date once the season gets rolling, just so they can keep the model open. The model sort of predicts things based on flower life, and when it thinks that all the flowers have fallen off the tree, regardless of whether or not they have, it will turn off the model. So you need to keep those models going. First thing to remember, predictions and forecasts are theoretical. They're just predicting risk. Use and based on weather data that's collected and sometimes forecasted from the weather station. Don't let these things throw you off, particularly if you don't have a weather station or if you have your own local system that's showing you much different levels of rain and heat accumulations and plant growth stages than what the models are predicting. Always use your stuff first, and remember they're just theoretical. Consider the history of fire blight in the planting. If you don't have fire blight the previous year, if you've never had fire blight, don't let the model's excessive language of high and extreme and infection and various extension alerts, including this one, intimidate you into making unnecessary antibiotics each time you get an alert released. Finally, consider the age and susceptibility of planting. Age and variety can make a pretty big role in the development of fire blight, and none of the models take these factors into consideration in a formal sense. Now, think about how to interpret these model predictions based on the trees that you have in terms of their age, the varieties, and the rootstock. If you have a really young susceptible planting of cider apples, it may be more important to protect these trees using more carefully monitored model predictions than like a 15-year-old Macintosh planting on resistant rootstocks. These two types of plantings are not going to warrant the same level of protection. You might want to spray the younger susceptible cider apples at a much lower threshold for risk than you would the other ones. And another thing to remember is these really only identifying a risk of infection. They're going to use the terms and they're going to be color coded into more extreme language. They're going to go dark red, and they're going to use the words extreme and infection, and vibrant red. Now remember, this is only risk based on weather conditions. If the variety is not susceptible, if you've had no fire blight ever, and if the trees aren't overly vigorous, the fire blight risk may be much less than what these models are telling you. Also, the weather forecasts and predictions can change frequently. Model predictions are based on weather forecasts, and when the forecasts change, so will the models as well. The bacteria can double about once every 20 minutes under optimal conditions, and then that's when temperatures start getting over 60 degrees. It really likes about 75 or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And now, fortunately, the models use weather hourly data, so they will actually accumulate and model the bacteria development a lot more accurately, but they can also show you the rapid growth. So make sure to always check those predictions fairly frequently, particularly those in the forecast. The 1 to 2 days out are the most reliable, and those 3 to 5 days out are much less accurate. NEWA uses the National Weather Service, so you can compare your own NEWA predictions to other temperature situations and weather forecast providers in the areas that you also like to use. As we're moving into bloom, I want to talk a little bit about some of the basic recommendations for managing blossom blight. Okay, so if you have an operation with no recent history, greater than 3 seasons of prevalent streptomycin resistant, generally like to recommend is right before that extreme and infection weather, those big red events at blooms, put an antibiotic application, and usually in this case it would be a single application of streptomycin at the 24-ounce rate per 100, assuming a 17% formulation, such as the agromycin 17 and whatnot. And at this time you can put in the regulate as well at about 1 pint per 100 gallons in that first strep spray to really enhance its effectiveness, and it could be very beneficial in really rapid drying conditions. And if you want to take it out later because you don't like the leaf yellowing, you could remove the regulate in later applications of streptomycin. However, you do know that with the leaf yellowing that the antibiotic is actually getting into the tissues. If you need a second application, you could continue to use streptomycin. It'd probably be very safe to do so. Or you can move into kasugamycin, Kasumin 2L, about 64 fluid ounces and 100 gallons of water. I recommend at least putting out 1 application of Kasumin at one of these high-risk periods during the season for resistance management purposes. And if you have concerns about the effectiveness or either, contact your regional extension specialist to discuss the product failure, and it may be important to submit a sample for antibiotic resistance testing. We're still offering this service, and you can find it on our blog. I'll put that up and show you that in a video later. Okay, now if you have streptomycin resistance, what are we recommending you do? Before the really high risk or extreme or infection weather at bloom, you might start out with a single application of kasugamycin if allowed. You may not be able to start if the label says so. You can't start the season off with that. You might have to try something different or a different type of antibiotic, oxytet, or maybe even a biological to get past that if there is still a restriction on the first application of the season. But the most scientifically intelligent thing to do would be to start with kasugamycin at 64 fluid ounces per acre. Include that penetrating surfactant in there to enhance the effectiveness, particularly under rapid drying conditions. Don't use alternate row metal spraying and those types of things. Kasugamycin can rapidly break down with exposure to sunlight. So anytime you want to do it, if you're going to do it during the day, make sure it's overcast. If you're going to do it and it's not overcast, put it on at night. And if you need later applications, Blossom Protect, 1 1/4 pounds per acre, and 8 of the active ingredient, and about 8.75 pounds of Buffer Protect. And you could use that or oxytetracycline. It's entirely possible to have a highly successful program with just Blossom Protect. It's definitely one of the best options for organic production systems. And if you need a couple, consider kasugamycin at the first and last. It seems to be that the last bit of the period around petal fall is typically when things get really, really hot, and that might be the best time to use another last strong dose of an antibiotic in your planting. If you're getting close to petal fall as well, you might want to back off on Blossom Protect to avoid any russeting. I've put Blossom Protect on at petal fall many, many times and have not seen russeting, but you might want to be careful if you have a high russet-prone variety. All right. And with that, that's sort of our basics to getting started with blossom management fire blight, and I'll put out more segments later.
And now for the State of the State, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from major fruit production regions of the state. I'm Anna Wallis from the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and as usual, the information I'll be sharing has been aggregated from regional specialists around the state, including Mike Bastow, Janet Van Zorn, Mario Miranda Sazo, Craig Kalki, and Dan Donahue. It also includes my own observations and information from NEWA. Weather this week has been kind of all over the place. We started off with kind of a cool early part of the week, and then we had 2 very cold mornings, Thursday and Friday morning, which affected different parts of the state differently. And then right after that, over the weekend, we moved into some really warm temperatures, which are continuing this week. So across the state in general, we're ranging from just a little bit earlier than the 15 and 30-year averages as far as degree day accumulation and phenology to way ahead of seasonal averages. So it tends to be really regionally specific, so you should be paying attention to your region. Thinking about the cold nights that happened Thursday and Friday morning last week, we were in 20s in many places throughout the state. Some of the colder sites were more inland in the Finger Lakes area with lows in the low 20s. Closer to the lake, we were in the upper 20s and mid 20s at some of the cooler sites. In the Hudson Valley, we had some temperatures in the mid to upper 20s, mostly upper 20s. We're looking for damage throughout the state. It's still a little bit early to tell how much damage, so we'll be continuing to watch that closely. There are a lot of really great resources looking at frost conditions, frost protection, and mitigation strategies, as well as evaluating frost damage. It's a really good idea to be evaluating frost damage at this point. If you can, be cutting buds both in different parts of the canopy and in different parts of your blocks, because it can be very different depending on the microclimate. And you really need that information to adjust your thinning appropriately. We're including a couple of resources in the show notes to help you with this. Again, the recording of the Cornell statewide frost management webinar that was recorded is linked in the show notes. And there is also a link to the Cornell Fruit Resources webpage, which includes additional frost protection information. There's also a link to an article from MSU Extension, which has really excellent pictures evaluating blossom and bud frost damage and how you should go about doing that. Moving into the weekend, we started to see some really warm temperatures, especially on Sunday and moving into the rest of the week, which is moving phenology ahead really quickly. Phenology across the state, in the Hudson Valley, apples are at various stages of bloom. In the lower part of the valley, we had the first kings open in early varieties like Pink Lady at the end of last week. At the Hudson Valley Lab, bloom started about on Sunday, and we're quickly moving into full bloom at the beginning of the week. And in the northern part of the valley, we're a little bit behind. As usual, there's about a few day difference between the northern and southern part of the valley. And we anticipate moving quickly into bloom throughout the rest of the week. Pears are at early petal fall. Peaches, cherries, and plums are approaching shuck split. And overall degree day accumulation is just about near 15 and 30-year averages, possibly a little bit higher at this point with the warming trend. Just as a reminder, I shared last week that average bloom dates for apples for the past 40 years were May 2nd, with the earliest on April 16th in 2022 and 2012, and the latest on May 16th in 1984. So we're just about right at average this year. With regard to insects, we're continuing to catch oriental fruit moth. We haven't had any codling moth yet at the Highland lab. In Western New York, in the Lake Ontario region, conditions continue to be well ahead of averages. A couple of weeks, we think, speaking of degree day accumulation and phenology, it was full pink at the end of last week, and the warm weather quickly pushed a lot of varieties into bloom early this week. The cold temperatures on Thursday and Friday morning were in the upper 20s and mid 20s at colder sites near the lake, lower 20s more inland. And so we've been continuing to evaluate damage. There is some out there, but there are also lots of healthy buds, and so we'll continue to watch that pretty closely. Oriental fruit moth has been caught in a few locations, but there hasn't been a biofix set yet in all locations, so we're continuing to watch that. Last week, we had one codling moth capture, but that was really early, and we did not capture one this week. So just a reminder to be making sure your codling moth traps are out maybe a little bit early this week. We typically recommend them around bloom. But because of the warm winter and early interesting season, it's a good idea to be ahead of things if you can be. In the capital region, early varieties like Zestar are at pink. Other varieties are still at advanced tice cluster. Peaches are in bloom and some approaching petal fall, and we're pretty close to average degree day accumulations. And in the Champlain Valley, early varieties are still at tight cluster. Others are at half-inch green. We're still slightly ahead of average degree day accumulations. We saw a tiny bit of frost damage from last week's cold events, and we're continuing to watch that. And now a few upcoming pest events to keep in mind. A reminder of the early season insects that you can be watching out for. It's been fairly quiet because of the cool temperatures most of this spring, but now that things are starting to warm up, we expect to see more activity. We've seen a little bit of tarnished plant bug activity, which is typical for this time of year. We'll start to see them around pink and more at petal fall. You can be monitoring them in the clusters, or you can be using white sticky cards. We're seeing more and more aphid activity, so we're looking for rosy apple aphid, which is usually typically active at the beginning of the season in clusters. Also, green apple aphid we've been seeing in clusters, so you can be inspecting for those. Woolly apple aphid has been seen in many parts of the state, typically on pruning cuts on the inside of the canopy or near the base of the tree. We're starting to see more of that. As I've said in the past, we're seeing some scale activity, both San Jose scale as well as other types of scale. So you can be looking for that typically on the inside of the tree and on the underside of branches is where it's protected. And you can also be starting to scout for mites at this time. We typically see them starting to be active around bloom. As far as the Lepidopteran complex, as I said, we've had some OFM captures throughout the state. The biofix for the Hudson Valley Lab was set on April 15, and we're continuing to see the flight. In other parts of the state, we've had a few captures, but no biofix set in many places yet. There's been very little codling moth activity in the state. We're expecting an early season in some places, so a reminder to make sure you have your traps ready. We've seen some oblique-banded leaf roller, overwintering larvae, and other lepidopterans feeding on clusters, so you can be looking for that activity now. And dogwood borer flight usually is beginning around the end of bloom, and so you can be watching out for that as well. With regard to diseases, Kerik did a great job again, as usual, giving a review of scab and fire blight infection considerations for this week. We're still looking for the first scab infection evidence, which will look like fuzzy olive green to brown lesions on leaves in unprotected sites. So you can be scouting for those in your orchard to make sure that primary scab hasn't gotten through in any locations. We're looking for powdery mildew on opening buds still. We're seeing more of that because it's been a little bit dry. So you can be looking for white, twisted, and distorted tissue on emerging buds. And with regard to fire blight, you can be looking on warm days, warm, dry days for ooze in your scouting, and then paying attention to forecasts with warming conditions and wetting events for infection events in your area to make sure that you stay protected. As we're starting to set biofixes and follow moth flights this season, I wanted to share an additional resource that we're starting this year. This is the statewide Orchard Pest Monitoring Network. It's a collection of information from industry members who are trapping for these key insect pests throughout the state. And all of these people are contributing data to this virtual resource. It's a blog with a dynamic map that I've created with the help from Dan Olmsted and my technician, Hannah Tolles, that you can filter to a specific region, a specific location, time frame, and species. And so the output is a table and a map that helps you track trends across the state. So if you're interested in seeing this resource or contributing data to the network, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to have additional collaborators, and we'll include the link to the site in the show notes. Thank you so much to everyone that has contributed to it so far. We have people from Extension, industry members, and grower collaborators. In case you missed it, we have the recording of our virtual IPM Scout training available online, where we shared best practices on how to monitor and scout for a few key insect pests. We'll link to that in the show notes. And now here are the current degree days in the major fruit-producing regions of the state. Throughout the season, we'll continue to align this information with previous work done by Art and Yellow relating to McIntosh phenology and degree days. As a point of reference, all of this is in base 43 Fahrenheit. Tight cluster in McIntosh is usually 228. Pink is 289, and full bloom is 378. according to NEWA stations throughout the Northeast. Current degree days are in Geneva, 333, in Highland at the Hudson Valley Lab, 412, Clifton Park, 292, Peru, 218, Medina, an inland site, 355, Appleton North, a lake site, 295, Fairville, an inland site, 326, and Williamson Deamery near the lake, 326. That table, as well as a table of upcoming pest events, is included in the show notes. Thanks again, and good luck until next week.
That concludes this week's update. Thanks for listening.